Okay, hello everyone. We're just checking, says people still dialing in. Okay, and we'll be recording this webinar as we go along, so you're aware of that. I'm just looking at the number of people dialing in. Okay, I think we're going to start. Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to our 1-hour webinar, where we're going to be talking about drone-based monitoring of habitats. And hopefully, by describing our experiences using drone remote sensing to map individual hawthorn shrubs and their biomass, we will encourage you to have a go as well. So my name is France Gerard. I'm from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and I'm an EO expert. And my colleagues also from the UK Centre for Ecology and speakers are Charles George, an expert in drone flying and remote sensing, Joel Walsh, a software engineer and an expert in deep learning, Doug Cully, who, among others, is an expert in Bayesian uncertainty modeling, and there's also Josh Hall, who is looking after our technical support for the webinar. So next slide, Charles, please. We only have 1 hour, so the idea today is to cover certain topics so that hopefully in the future, when you're considering using drones and drone remote sensing, you will find it less daunting. So first, I'm going to give you some background related to the work that we've done and that we're presenting here. Then Charles will cover everything to do about drone campaigns, things to think about when you're considering using drones. Joe will introduce you to deep learning for drone image analysis and hawthorn shrub mapping. And then we'll have a break. And then finally, Doug will talk about the steps we took to convert our shrub map into biomass and how we incorporated uncertainty into this. And I think the way we've timed this, we should have plenty of time for questions and answers. So please share your questions in the chat, and Josh will make sure that we can go through them at the end. Okay, next slide, Charles. Okay, so basically this work that we're going to present today is part of a large Horizon-funded project called MAMBO, which stands for Modern Approaches to the Monitoring of Biodiversity. And click again, Charles. And the work that we've done is part, although this project delivers a wide variety of activities, the work we've done fits in within the work package 4, which stands for Remote Sensing for Habitat Assessment. And then again, another click, Charles. So this work package was looking at 2 major strands. One strand is to think about how to use remote sensing to deliver plant species and habitat distribution maps through modeling, using deep learning, combining species observation with satellite data. And if you're interested in that particular part of the work, you can join the MAMBO team on a webinar on the 9th of October. The other major strand of the work looked at using remote sensing for habitat condition monitoring, habitat condition metrics. And we focused specifically at using drone image data or LiDAR data, whether it was collected by drone or aircraft. And we looked at a particular list of matrices that we felt were quite interesting and important. And one of them was shrub cover and biomass in non-woody habitats using drone image. And this is what we are talking about today. Other metrics that we looked at was a vegetation structure in woody and non-woody environments using LiDAR. And again, if you're interested in that topic, the MAMBO team will be presenting on the 16th of October. We also looked at linear features using LiDAR, and we looked at dead wood, identifying mapping dead wood in woody habitats using LiDAR. Next slide, Charles. So why would you consider using drones for monitoring? From my personal perspective, it's quite obvious. The setup is relatively affordable compared to other entities, but specifically if you go for a drone camera combo. Using drones makes it extremely flexible to time your campaign. You can actually, more or less pick and go, set up, take your kit and go for it. And so basically you can work around the weather very easily. And you can also quite easily do repeat visits if you wanted to. And then the most attractive part of it is the spatial detail, of course. Depending on how high you fly, you can achieve centimeter detail, which allows you to start identifying individual plant species and plant entities, as you can see in some of the examples that I've shown. And some people have already started looking at dead wood as well, using drone carried LiDAR. But then there are still, I find, when I look around, some that the uptake is quite limited, even though there are people using drones. And the barriers could be for several. And it could well be that when you are considering doing drones, you might be wondering, what does it take to fly a drone? And that might stop you. Do I need an expert? What does the kit look like? How much will it cost me? And that might already stop you for going for it. Then the next stage would be the pre-processing. What does it involve? Again, do I need to be an expert to do this? Where's the software? Where's the hardware? Then the next stage is, how to derive useful information. And again, how tricky will that be? What about deep learning? Everyone's using deep learning. Can I actually have a go at this? And again, lots of questions about hardware and software, and that might actually stop you from having a go. And I remember about 10 or 15 years ago, these were the type of things that stopped me from having a go. Next slide. Okay, so our use case is mapping hawthorn shrubs, and once we've mapped the shrubs to derive biomass from that, and that was in Strawberry Hill Farm in the UK. This is a farm that was abandoned about 25 years ago, so it's sort of a natural rewilding site, and it's mainly shrubs. It's in certain areas quite densely covered shrubs, and in some areas it's still quite open. It reminds me of a savanna landscape. The main shrubs are hawthorn shrub, but we also have blackthorn, we have rose, and we have bramble. And so when we are flying the image drone, we can have an image mosaic at the end of the day, and also a 3D point cloud structure derived from structure for motion. Next slide, Charles. And
yeah, France. Sorry, over time. Just to let you know.
That's fine. I'll keep going. So basically, this is my final slide. So typically, when you are using drone imagery, you'll look at a workflow. In our case, was to derive shrubs, but you might want to derive slightly different features. You end up starting with your drone campaign, then you collect the drone imagery. There's some pre-processing required, which will give you 2D imagery and a point cloud. And then you need to carry out some labeling to train your model. Generally, it will be a deep learning model, which you then have to apply, and it will extract a feature. And that's the output you're aiming for. And in our case, it was the shrubs. But we added an additional workflow that allowed us to then use these individual shrubs, use the height data that we've got from our point cloud, extract some shrub characteristics from it, and then feed it through an allometric equation that allowed us to then derive shrub biomass. The allometric equations were developed by some destructive sampling in situ at Strawberry Hill Farm. So this was the workflow we were facing, and now the team are going to go a little bit more in depth, looking at some of these things. So Charles is going to cover the drone campaigns. And over to you, Charles.
Sorry. Hello. So yeah, I'm Charles George. Been working at CH as an Earth observation scientist for quite a long time. Been flying drone surveys for environmental reasons since 2016. I'm going to go very briefly, because we haven't got a lot of time, but very briefly sort of over what sort of equipment might be needed for a drone campaign, what licenses you may need, a little bit on sort of time scales and data storage, software and hardware that you might need, pros and cons to using drones, and then maybe do you want to subcontract it out or actually do the work yourself? So as Francis just said, the case study is Strawberry Hill Farm. That's 1.5 square kilometers. For this study, we took nearly 3,800 photos from the drone, and that's 11 separate flights, and this took nearly all day. The reason it takes so long is because when you're flying a drone, it has to be within visual line of sight all the time. You have to be able to see the drone at all times, and it's only allowed to be 500 meters away from you, and actually at 500 meters you can hardly see it. It's just a speck. And as you see in the sort of the southern area here, I wasn't able to actually fly there because this area is too dense to actually get into at the time, and I wouldn't have been able to keep the drone within sight. So as you saw from the previous slide, there were sort of many photos, and the reason you need so many is because you need sort of up to 80% overlap, both along track and sideways, and this allows the same feature in many adjacent images to be identified using pattern matching. So we then use structure from motion software, and this sort of uses trigonometry to place any sort of feature or pixel within that 3D space. And then we can use this information to build orthomosaics, digital surface models, point clouds, and any other 3D models that we want. And in this case, we use it for red, green, and blue imagery, but you can also use it for multispectral and even thermal imagery, as long as there's a lot of contrast and you can actually pick out the individual features. These are some of the results. So in the middle there, that's a geolocated orthomosaic, and we're looking at 9mm for each pixel. So there's actually quite a lot of detail. And then on the right, you've got the digital surface model. So you can see that sort of the blue area in the middle is a very small stream running through there. So it's like a valley. So that's lower than the edges. But you can also see that individual plants or trees are picked out as well. So this is another of the products, was a point cloud. And from here you can see the 3D structure of the survey area in much more detail. So you can even see the trails where people have walked through within the grass. Obviously trees are picked out very well. It is also showing, though, that one of the problems with using point clouds derived from structure from motion, because it's just using photographs which are taken from above, then anything that's on the ground under dense vegetation, there's no data there at all. If you use a point cloud from LiDAR data, that would actually go through the vegetation, you'd be getting ground hits. Stop. So survey equipment, well, obviously you need a drone. The drones we use sort of the Mavic series, and they're about just about a kilogram in weight, just over maybe. The modern version would be the Mavic 3E, which is about €3,500 to buy. If you get a drone, you need to make sure it the flight control software will enable mapping with waypoints. What I mean by that is within the software, you need to be able to draw a polygon around the area to be surveyed. You then tell it the height that you want it to fly at, and then the overlap, and the software will then work out the flight route. And then pretty much when you get to the site, once you've set up, you just press go and it will just fly itself along the flight route. It's also a good idea to have a mechanical shutter on the drone rather than an electronic shutter, because as it's moving, electronic shutters can sort of smear out the pixels a little bit. So you want a mechanical one and you'll get a much sharper picture. And it's exactly the same for, you can get a thermal drone, same sort of size, obviously a little bit more expensive because it's got more technology within it. And of course, multispectral as well. So again, a little bit more expensive, but the multispectral will have the red edge, a band in the red edge, as well as red, green and blue, and also a band in the near infrared. And of course, this is ideal for vegetation surveys. As far as locational accuracy is concerned, so if you're just doing a one-off, then it may be perfectly reasonable just to, it won't matter if you're 2 meters out. If you're just counting trees, for example, it doesn't matter where exactly they're located. If, however, you're doing some sort of, for example, change detection, where you might need to overlay this year's imagery on next year's imagery, then you want to get down to sort of centimeter type accuracy. For that, you'd need RTK, which is real-time kinematic, and that's within the drone. And then you also need a global navigation satellite receiver. And again, that's extra cost. Could be anything up to €3,500, but there are cheaper versions out there. Real-time kinematic. So you need a base station, which is the GNS receiver I was talking about. You put that over a known position. It's then getting signals from the satellites, but because it knows where it is exactly, then any errors that are caused by atmospheric anomalies, water vapor will slow down the timing signal and move the position around a little bit. It works out what errors are being beamed down, and then transmits these error corrections to the rover in real time. And then the rover will then know its position to within 10 centimeters. And so it will record that for each image that's being taken. We can also use ground control points. As you can see in the picture here, there's a ground control point is just something that will show up in the drone imagery. You would need to survey in these ground control points, and you'd probably have 5 or 6 over the whole area. They're used for both for actually within the processing to make the locational accuracy improved, especially if you don't have RTK within your drone, but also you can use it to validate your accuracy as well. Most people nowadays don't use GCPs because the RTK system is accurate enough, and it's very time consuming to be putting out these GCPs. IT equipment. So structure and motion software that we use is WebODM. This is open source. I've tested it against other paid software, structure and motion softwares, and it's as accurate. All of the any of this structure and motion software though will need a fairly good multi-core, newish, I suppose, fast clock speed processor. You need at least 32 gigabytes of RAM, but really you want 64 or even 128. A solid state drive is very good. It speeds up the processing a lot. For the 1.5 kilometer square area that we were processing, we used about 200 gigabytes. So that's for the raw data and for the processed products. And if your finances go good enough, then you can even use a graphics card as well, and that will speed up the processing a little. The personnel in the UK, I'm only going to talk about the UK, being as we're now not part of the EU, but I think it's very similar over there. But so for the UK, there's three sort of scenarios really. So there's flying far from people, which means anything over 150 meters. I want to say people, I mean people, but that includes people in houses, in boats, in cars. So you've got to stay away from roads and rivers, canals. In this country, then you need a flyer ID, which is just an online theory test. And then your organization will need an operator ID. This then gives you a registration number that you have to stick on all of your drones. So it's the same number for all of the drones within an organization. You can fly slightly more close to people, so that's up to 50 meters. From January 26, that will be 30 meters if the drone has a certain class mark on it. Again, you need the flyer and the operator ID as before, but then you can do an online course, which is the A2 C of C, so Certificate of Competence, and that course is approximately €170. If you then want to fly you can fly over people as long as it's not crowds of people, and then you can fly over buildings and roads to a certain extent. Again, you need the flyer and operator ID, but then you have to do a general visual line of sight certificate. Again, that's an online course, maybe €570, but this also includes a practical flight test. And lastly, I suppose to fly commercially in the UK, we need insurance, liability insurance, and it has to cover up to €850,000 of liability. We pay, I think, for 16 drones, we pay about €3,500 for the policy for that. So the pros and cons of using drones. So France covered a little of this earlier on. So importantly, you are definitely in control of the timing and the frequency. So if it's bad weather one day, you can wait and go the next day. Obviously, high spatial detail. So depending how high you fly, then you can get down to millimeter pixels. But then again, it might be just too much information. So it's something you need to think about. Once you've got all the kit and you've got the expertise and you've passed all your licenses, then repeat observations are very affordable. It's just time. It is actually very easy to fly a drone. Most of them pretty much fly themselves nowadays. And especially if you're flying for science as well, then you can have a choice of putting experimental sensors onto the drone. Disadvantages: the area covered is limited by flight time, so that's generally the amount of batteries that you can carry. And also some areas can't be flown because of restrictions such as you can't fly near airports or around prisons. You do require a pilot's license, but that's something you can get hold of. You can't fly when it rains, because even if you can find a drone that will fly in the rain, but there's lots of water between the sensor and what you're looking at. Also, wind affects when you can fly. Otherwise, your drone might disappear into the distance. You can also get interference, so there will be a lot of people sort of, "What are you doing, mister?" So that it's sometimes good to have somebody with you to fend off those questions. Birds of prey can be a problem as well. That they have been known to attack drones, which can be very interesting. Pre-processing. So you need to build up a knowledge of what you're doing, so that can take time. Another problem can be proprietary software. So some of the sensors that you use, such as LiDAR, for example, you need to use the company's own software to get the data into any sort of format that can be used by other general software. So so for DJI, for example, for the LiDAR, you have to use their software to get the LiDAR into a LAS format. Drone equipment requires maintenance and updating, of course, which then costs money. And then there's privacy issues. So if you accidentally take a picture of somebody looking up and you can actually identify them, you have to pixelate it before you can use any of the products. Whether to subcontract or not to subcontract, I think this generally comes down to cost. So it's the frequency of your surveying which probably will dictate. So if you're flying maybe just once or twice a year, then it probably makes more sense to subcontract it out. And again, that frequency, you won't have gained the expertise or the for both the flying and processing the data if you're only flying a couple of times a year. If, however, you're flying 15 times a year, it's definitely worth investing in the equipment and the resources for the personnel. A negative might be, if you do subcontract it out, would be control that you've got. So the subcontractor could well just pre-process it how they want to do it. So not taking into account what your requirements may be, something to think about definitely. And then, do you own the raw data as well? So sometimes they might just want to give you the product and not the actual raw data. So if you're thinking of a different science question further down the line and you haven't got the raw data, then there's not a lot you can do about it. And I think that's me, and it's over to Joe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Charles. Give me a moment to find my presentation. Am I sharing correctly? Can you see the?
Not yet.
Oh, hang on. Apologies. We did practice this.
There it is. Ready.
Brilliant. So thank you all very much for coming today. So I'm going to give a bit of a linkage talk that takes us from the drone data to methods and metrics for estimating shrub biomass. And one approach that we've got for doing this is with a fairly traditional deep learning model that takes drone imagery and a set of shrub outlines and enables us to recognize shrubs in a scene captured by a drone, to then from the 2D outlines of a shrub's footprint, estimate its dimensions, its height, and feed into methods for calculating biomass in the rewilding site. So I'll give a short overview of deep learning applications for remote sensing in general, talk a bit about the model that's been selected for this project, and some hints and tips on preparing your own data for carrying out training. And this material is going towards a workshop with Charles in November, taking you from drone data acquisition through to deep learning model output. So the task of demystifying deep learning could easily take up 15 minutes, but to give a very quick overview for a general audience, we're taking a set of images that show what we want to learn about, and for training, a set of annotations for each image that indicates per image or per pixel how it's classified, what meaning there is in it. And then we train a neural network which takes as inputs pixels, which could be 3-band or multiple bands, pass them through different layers, which recognize different qualities of things in the image, pick out lines and edges, pick out shapes, build those inferences up into identifying a whole scene, and predicts what the image contains. And what those predictions look like very much depends on the problem we're trying to solve. So there's a whole range of remote sensing, image machine learning tools and techniques. You'll hear the term model architecture, which describes how these layers are chosen, how they connect to each other, and then also different sets of labels, whether we've just got one or more classifications that say an image is urban, or if we've got bounding boxes that pick out individual trees, or a label per pixel. So classification type models might be used in land use assessments. These are just giving one or more probable labels to an individual scene, say semantic segmentation, where this is an approach that's more traditionally used in land cover mapping, where you've got areas of an image that are covered in different terrain, have got different qualities, so you've got a label per pixel, and you're able to predict, push the image through the model and predict what each pixel is it grassland, is it wetland, etc. Object detection is another approach that's got a lot of usage in remote sensing image analysis, where the labels you're giving the model are bounding boxes that just say an object is here, doesn't necessarily outline its shape, just tells you it's in a location and it's this thing. There are change detection techniques where you've got a time series of images capturing the same area to be able to detect what's changed between them, and ideally also be able to characterize and say, there's more forest now, there's less road. And many more techniques, including point clouds, versions of all of these things, segmentation, change detection, but we're not going to get into any more detail here, but talk a bit about the model architecture that we're using with the data that Charles has been capturing out in Strawberry Hill and developing material to help people run the same techniques, build models tuned to their own data. So the design is called a UNet. The original UNet paper comes from the biomedical domain. You can see, I think that's a wee image for the paper, detecting the outlines of lungs and whether or not they've got certain conditions with the label and then the prediction based on the input image. So it's called a UNet because it's U-shaped. So the first set of layers compresses the image down into a very long flat list of numeric features, and then the second half expands it back into its original form. And if you put an unlabeled image through, you'll get predictions out with the uncompressed image. It comes from the biomedical domain, partly because in that area, data is often scarce. There aren't that many samples to work with. And so an advantage of this style of model is that you can build it with relatively few examples of what you're looking for, with hundreds rather than many thousands of examples that you would need for a classification model. And specifically with our research partners, we've chosen to use an attention UNet. It's a slightly later variation of the original UNet. And the intention with it is that it will pick out the most meaningful features of the image. Sorry, my slides are slightly out of order. So here's an example of the results that we're guessing with this approach. This is taken from one of the publications of our research collaborators. So you can see and I'll go into this a bit further on. You can see the relative performance improvement between the original UNet and the attention UNet, where we've got the pink overlay there, which is a mask of extracted features in the whole image. And so how is this done? How do we build this up from scratch? We've got the drone imagery auto-rectified, prepared as a very large geotiff. We've got a set of annotations made by manual tracing in a GIS like QGIS in the form of a shapefile. And each one represents the outline of a hawthorn in that site in Strawberry Hill. So we extract a small square image that's centered on each one and create a grayscale image that's either showing 0 for background, not a shrub, or 255, it is a shrub. And then also extract about twice as many images that are pure background, so we can show the model what isn't a shrub as well as what is. So here's an example of the prepared labels that we're using as input into that attention unit. And then here's a parallel example, they're not exactly like for like, of each tiny segment patch as a terminal here, each image patch that we're giving to the model. This is an arduous task, that of human labeling, painstakingly working through the outlines in a GIS, and it's probably the biggest time sink in preparing your own data to work with this approach. There are techniques for AI-assisted labeling, effectively using an existing model to suggest outlines for you and potentially also retraining it so that it's improving as you keep annotating. A project to look back on if you're interested in learning about this approach is Pearl by Development Seed. They did a collaboration quite a few years ago with Microsoft Planetary Computer that took this approach. Another angle that we'd love to follow during the rest of the Mambo projects is using extracted shrub outlines from LiDAR to then extrapolate 2D footprints. So where we've got a small amount of LiDAR data, we can use that to bootstrap a much larger set of inferences from 2D data. Then the training process, it's important when you're collecting data to have a balance of examples. If there are many different classes of thing that you're looking for, if you've got a more complex land cover problem, for example, then your model will become, excuse me, will become quite biased if it sees a few examples of one thing and many of another. There are techniques known as augmentation for making very slight jittery changes to your input images so you can bulk out the samples you've got. But there are also some caveats when working with remote sensing data, geographic data, and particularly to avoid rotating images too far, avoid flipping them at all, so that you're not generating impossible shadows, which the model is then trying to learn features from. Then as we train, we take our data sets, show the model batches of images until they've all been seen. That's one epoch of training, test how we're doing, and then keep going with that process until our results stop improving. So when we create our training data set, we reserve a small amount for validation so that we're able to check and test the performance of the model against a set it's never seen. And then we also keep back a set about the same size of test data, sort of totally quarantined, could be used for benchmarking. We guarantee that it's never been touched during the training process, so we're avoiding leakage where we think we're performing better than we really are, because some of our test data is leaked into training. So there are a whole set of metrics you can get, and we saw in that overview from C's group, a whole set of metrics relating the volume of false positives to false negatives, a headline measure called accuracy, which typically for this kind of problem isn't the one to look at. There are scores for individual classes, but for a segmentation problem like this, the scores to be looking at are intersection over union or Jacquard score, where we're looking at the spatial overlap between the area that we've correctly predicted and the area that we've incorrectly predicted. And that's the main metric that we steer by to know how well our model's performing. So the hard work and the place to start with all of this is in data curation. To put the time and effort into labeling, into doing visual QA, into getting a small set of data as right as you can, carefully selecting it to make sure that we're showing the model a good variety of variations, of representative features of shrubs in this case. And that while we're preparing, curating our training data, we're managing it as well as we can, keeping track of versions of training data that we create, and keeping our experiments reproducible so that when we're retraining, fine-tuning models, we're able to link back to exactly the data that was used. I hope that some of this has inspired you to try these approaches yourselves, or to look at the approaches you've got and compare. And you might be asking, how technical do I need to be? How easily can I get to grips with this work? So while if you want to get right into the depths of designing your own models, there are frameworks, for, mostly in Python, quite popular ones for doing that, like PyTorch and TensorFlow. There are also model hubs and repositories where you can find pre-trained models to experiment with. Hugging Face is a big public one. Icarus.eu has got a collection of reusable models, and try and use that as a basis for fine-tuning with your own data. Another limitation in making this work accessible is access to GPU-based computers. Powerful GPUs can be really expensive. And that's one reason that we've chosen for this project and this problem a more traditional model architecture, which is relatively quick and cheap to train and to run. We're using for our projects and for the public-facing workshops that we're planning to do in November, the freely available, though quite time-limited GPUs that you can get from Google Colab's notebook service. And that's me. We've got a workshop coming up in November. Please consider signing up if you haven't already. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And I've just noticed we've already used a whole hour, but hopefully you have time to hang around for after our break. So we definitely had more to talk about than we thought. But hopefully you've enjoyed it so far. So I suggest we have a 5-minute break, and hopefully some of you can join us in about 5 minutes time. So we're talking about 10:50. Okay, so
we started 15 minutes early, France, so we've still got 15 minutes.
Okay, we're cool. Good. Right, see you in 5 minutes. Let's go for it, Doug. I've seen a lot of thumbs up, so I'm assuming everyone's there.
Oh,
let's go for it.
Very enthusiastic then. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about how to take stuff you've already seen and go to that to work out kind of allometric relationships in shrubs, and also try and get estimates of carbon in your beautiful rewilding shrubland. I think I'm on last, not just because it's the end of the workflow chain, but also because this is like the newest, I'm going to say, rather than most rushed part of the talks. Means I'll probably rattle through it quite quickly, but there's a bit at the end where it'd be great to get people's input. So just stay to the end and find out how you might be able to help develop this a bit more. So how do we get kind of estimates of particularly carbon or biomass from a shrubland area? Well, the obvious way is to chop it down and weigh it, which is actually what we did. You can see some photos of here chopping down and weighing some of the shrubs, particularly hawthorn at Strawberry Hill. There's two problems with this. Three problems. First off, it's a lot of work. Second off, you start feeling guilty for chopping down all your shrubs. And third off, once you chop them down, you have no longer any biomass. So you can't rely just on that. I think the answer is going to be using drone imagery in the end, but we'll get to that in a bit. The second point is to actually start taking a few more measurements while you're doing this that you then start building a model on. So before we did this, we had the foresight to go out and measure shrub diameter and shrub heights of all these shrubs we were about to chop down. And then after we chopped them down, we dried them to try and get some dry weight of some of the shrub, not all of it. And then even a smaller sample of that, we did something clever. I'm not entirely sure what it was, but we did something clever to get the carbon content of those shrubs as well, which gave us a nice load of data ranging from information about the size and shape of the shrubs right down to what the carbon content is with some of the biomass that we destroyed. And we've used this to build a basically, I'm calling it a hierarchical model. It is a hierarchical model to go from those measurements that we made right down to carbon. So the basic measurements we had was height and diameter. I think we were measuring canopy, weren't we, diameter here, but it could be DBH, or it could be other measures of diameter as well. We also, for some of them, have species, although we're only looking at one species here, hawthorn. You can also collect things like tree rings and number and stems, which we have for some of that. And then we have all these other measurements we did to get down to carbon. Now, thing is, the more measurements you have for this, the better when we're building these models. But we've designed a model here that can predict whatever you don't have. So if you don't have all these measurements, the idea is that the model will fill in the gaps along the chain. If you don't have wet biomass, but you still manage to get some carbon, you'll be able to predict wet biomass. Eventually, we're hoping that we'll be able to start predicting what species you're looking at, and things like stem numbers as well. We're not quite at that stage yet. But the point is, you don't have to have all the data, but the more data, the better. And you don't have to have data for everything. So like I said, we've got carbon estimates for subsamples of shrubs, but not the entire shrubs themselves. So we're trying to build something here that's nice and flexible. But the very basics behind it is you take your measurements of diameter, height, and carbon, like we have here on the left. We represent that as a very, very simple cylindrical representation of what a shrub looks like. We combine it all together with Bayesian inference, and we train a model to try and get some idea of what carbon might look like. And this is measured carbon from our field sites. We've done some training here, and this is the modeled carbon we get out of it at the end. This is, we haven't separated out training from test data here yet. We haven't enough data for that. But the idea is that we then at some point be able to separate out shrub measurements for things we want to test versus the kind of model. But anyway, the point is we've calibrated this model on our height and diameter and carbon measurements. Okay, we built this in an uncertainty framework using this Bayesian inference method. I'm not going into Bayesian inference in a lot of detail here, but if you're interested to know why you always have to take 2 tests for some diseases at the doctors, or if you want a better way of finding your keys if you ever lose them, then have a look into Bayesian inference. It's really interesting. But the nice thing that we use for it here is it helps us kind of work out what the uncertainties are when we're designing these allometric models. And it helps us partition them into 2 different types of uncertainty. We have uncertainty in things which are a bit noisy. This could be that we didn't quite get the tape measure of the right height, or we didn't count up all the twigs when we chopped down the shrubs that we trained on. But also things that we structural uncertainties, things that we can't necessarily control for very well, which might extrapolate to scales. This is things like not getting the right shape of hawthorn. So, for example, we have 2 pictures of hawthorn on the right. Doesn't really look like our cylinder, either of them. So there's 2 different types of uncertainty here. And the reason we want to separate these out is because the structural uncertainty doesn't cancel at scale. You go to bigger and bigger scales, you still have that uncertainty. But the noise uncertainty, we can start cancelling out. So it's actually a way, the reason we're using this allometric model in an uncertainty framework is to help us cancel out the uncertainties we don't need to consider when we start going to bigger scales. And that's what you can see in these plots here. So I've just redrawn the train model for carbon versus height for diameter. Notice there's more points here because we have more diameter and height measurements than we did carbon measurements. And you can see there's 2 little different bars here. There's this light blue, cyan, I think it is. This is the uncertainty, including the noise. And then there's this dark blue, which is more the structural uncertainty. And the nice thing is that if you're thinking about individual shrubs, you need that bigger range. If you start looking at larger and larger areas, you can start going towards that smaller range, that kind of blue area there. So once we train the model, we get these kind of, what's it called? I guess not spatial maps. I don't know, surfaces. That's what I was after. Surfaces of how you might get biomass for individual shrubs versus your diameter and height. Versus what that might be if you were looking at shrubs in a larger area. So on the left-hand side of these two plots, we have the lower estimates. This is the 10th percentile. Probably should be using the 5th percentile, but I want to show a little bit more skill in this presentation. And you basically take your diameter and height and read off what your biomass estimate is in there. This is in carbon, by the way. So you have a lower range, and then the right you have an upper range. So when you just look at individual shrubs, it's kind of a bit more constrained at the lower range, but when you go to the upper range, your shrubs, large, high shrubs could be anywhere between 6 and 100 kilos based on the training data we have. This means we need more data to actually constrain a bit better. The nice thing is, though, we can cancel some of these uncertainties out. So when we go to larger scales, we can start looking at uncertainty range between 17 and 40, which is nice and narrow. The bit that we have still working on is extending this to drone imagery. I'm going to show you an example here, which isn't from the drone imagery, but from people going around with a tape measure. But it kind of gives you a little bit of a hint of what's going on. So this is our Strawberry Hill site again. I'm overlaying places where we have height and diameter measurements. The diameter has been exaggerated. If it's yellow, the taller. If it's blue, the shorter. And from that, we can start getting upper and lower estimates of carbon for these individual shrubs. And I think the idea is eventually, once we get enough shrubs in this area, we can actually start adding it all up and getting estimates for carbon for the entire site. So this is where some extra help would be good. First off, we do have some slightly larger uncertainties. So if anyone has any measurements of height, diameter, tree rings, biomass, carbon, doesn't have to be all of it, just bits of it. For hawthorn, that would help constrain the model for more. But importantly, it'd be good to extend this to other species as well. So if anyone has any data for not hawthorn, that would be great. And then we can start using this method to summarize what I've got in here, that you can start taking direct weight measurements, using that to train an allometric model, and use that with drone imagery to scale your biomass estimates to landscapes. There's a link to a Jupyter notebook we're developing. It actually works pretty well at the moment, but it's not the full model, where you can actually start plugging your own numbers and start training an allometric model to estimate biomass as well. There we go. Did I save some time? Oh, questions and answers. Sorry.
Yes, you did. You did save some time. But hopefully people will be happy to extend the webinar, and so we have some time to answer questions if there are questions. So, but before we start, Joe mentioned it already, we are planning to have a more hands-on online course about the drone campaigns, how to deliver a drone campaign and applying the unit on the drone imagery. And that will be held on the 18th and the 19th of November. Registration is not open soon, but keep an eye on this webpage. Or if you're really interested, just leave your details in the chat with course mentioned, and then we'll capture that and we'll let you know how to register. We'll point you to the link when the registration is open. So this was us. Any suggestions, feedback, questions, it's up to you now. I'm waiting to hear, or I can see some clapping, but yeah. Any questions? I'm looking at the chat. I can't see anything in the chat. Josh, are you seeing anything?
Nothing Q&A either. But participants can unmute themselves if you want to ask a question.
Yeah. Okay, doesn't look like there's any questions at all. Okay. No questions. So then, with no further ado, okay.
I think it's a couple coming in. Yeah.
There's a couple coming in, so let's just wait. Have you used an iPad to do a biomass estimates of shrubs? I guess, Jill, I'm just wondering, is that with the laser, using the laser scan on your iPad? Is that what you mean? Can you expand, Jill? Can you just maybe switch on your microphone and expand a little bit?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. Yeah, I've got the microphone on. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. No, well, there was a lot of work done in mangroves where they used some iPad technology to go round and round mangrove trees to assess the biomass. So they were able to pick up all of the individual roots and all of the individual stems and things, and they got very good estimates. And they, compared this with chopping down the trees. So it meant you could get a very detailed, very close match to the biomass of the mangrove trees. I don't know what the technology is. I've just downloaded a paper that I was looking for. You probably know all about this, but I just remember hearing about it a while ago.
It is a very interesting approach, and yes, we are very aware of that. Whereas, I mean, the iPad behaves like a terrestrial laser scanner, basically, and you can capture an individual shrub, and there are teams in UK who have actually done some more sophisticated terrestrial laser scanning in the tropical forest to scan individual trees or a whole hectare of trees, and use some sophisticated algorithms to then pick up from the point cloud, reconstruct the individual trees and branches, and then estimate biomass from that. It could replace maybe destructive sampling eventually, but what we're aiming to do here is actually to allow us to cover a wider area through drone image observations, and to allow it to become quite affordable by extracting height derived from structure from motion. There's uncertainty associated to that, so we're not really relying on LiDAR anymore. It's structure from motion, it's imagery, affordable imagery. And once we've trained the unit, and we can have a workflow automatically extract the shapes, the diameter of the shrubs and the height of the shrubs. And then
yes, I was just thinking in your training, I was just thinking in your training data initially to get as a good estimate as possible.
Yeah, that's definitely something to consider. This iPad LiDAR. Tom, I can see you had your hand up. Tom Lancashire.
Oh yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Yeah, that was really good. It was really interesting. So yeah, thank you very much. I just all those things combined, the sort of the drone image capturing and the deep learning ultimately ended up in the biomass estimate. How transferable do you think this is to other habitats outside of sort of shrublands? For example, woodlands, or sort of grasslands, that sort of area, perhaps that aren't quite as shrubby, for example.
Okay, I will talk about the grasslands that are not quite shrubby, and I think Doug was making, I could see his facial expression, he wants to answer. So basically, Strawberry Hill Farm is extremely shrubby, right? It's very dense, and actually we focused on trying to identify shrubs that are on their own. And we've been avoiding these dense parts of Strawberry Hill so far, because that's a slightly different approach there. So in a grassland where you have shrubs, I think this methodology would work really well to map the shrubs, specific species, or you could also ignore, you could also decide not to be species specific and then do your shrub mapping. There will always be a limitation in terms of, how small is the shrub that we can detect, how small the shrub can we detect. And that all depends on how we fly. And we actually haven't tested that either. But I think the whole idea of what we try to develop is to try and make it as transferable as possible. Doug, you wanted to say something as well.
I think it's along the same lines, but it's a bit more nerdy, I guess. I don't know. Joe maybe is more nerdy. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, in terms of the allometry side, kind of, I guess the motivation for getting into this is that we don't necessarily have very good ideas about shrub allometry. Like, I think some people have done some great work on it, the people who have, but there's a lot less research it is than for tree allometry, for example. And part of the reason is because shrubs fall this weird thing between being a woody thing and being a bit more herbaceous. You think about brambles and stuff; they can grow all over the place, versus hawthorns, which can be a bit more tree-like. So we try to get the allometry model to kind of reflect that weird diversity you can get in different types of shrubs. And the nice thing about that is it does make it a bit more flexible as well. So I guess it's a smaller step to get from grasses than it would be if you're using a tree allometry, for example. But yeah, no, it's really fascinating that we have this kind of in-between life forms that we have to try and train the allometry model on as well. So yeah, more flexibility is good.
Yeah, I can see a question from Jürgen. Yeah. I can see a question from Jürgen. Do you do any work or interaction with the ESA biomass mission for the large-scale biomass estimation using both satellite and drones? No, we don't. But we would, I think maybe now it's time to maybe to reach out to groups like that and start collaborating. Okay. There's quite a few people have left us, understandably, because we've run out, we've gone over time. So I think this is it. If you have more questions later on, you can still use this to continue. I think this chat will stay there, right, Josh? You can continue putting some questions in there and we can try and answer them. Okay, I'm going to close this event and thank you for joining us, and hopefully you find this webinar, at least you find some of the things that we presented here interesting. Okay, goodbye.
Thanks. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everyone.